Later on this afternoon, when he'll give his decision, once the judge was off the bench, Sean Combs was escorted out by the marshals. The judge told him he's going to have to cool his heels in the courthouse for a bit. But as he left the courtroom, there were applause from the gallery, some cheers in the gallery, where members of his family have been in steadfast vigil. His mother here most days, his twin daughters back, his sons have been here most days. They cheered for their father after he was acquitted of the most serious charges that he faces, still convicted of transportation for the purposes of prostitution. And now we await the decision as to whether he's going to be released on bail. If he is, he will walk out to a crowd that includes people holding up Sean John T-shirts and other supporters who have been here saying, "Where's the Rico?" They've been shouting that into the street for weeks, and they would certainly welcome this verdict if he is to walk out those golden doors, Kira. For the jury, they really had to make a difficult decision, not just on the racketeering conspiracy, but as the defense said, the women that Combs was accused of trafficking were also his long-term girlfriends. Cassie Ventura with him for 11 years, Jane with him for more than 3 years. And the defense tried to argue that they were consensual relationships, that they were in it just as much as he was because that was their lifestyle, even though they freely admitted the polyamorous swingers kink was not everybody's cup of tea. But he said these women were in it, and it required the jury to make distinctions between consent and coercion and love and control and free will. And in the end, they acquit on the most serious charges that carried a minimum sentence of 15 years, acquitting on sex trafficking in addition to the racketeering conspiracy, Kira.
Bernard, I want to bring you back in on that. As Aaron was saying, this really came down to violence and fear versus love, infidelity, and jealousy. We are watching the doors now to see if lawyers will be coming out and coming to the mics. But Bernarda, Sean Combs may be acquitted of the most serious charges here. But let's talk about the impact all of this will have on ongoing civil cases.
Yes, so you have to think, so even though he was acquitted of the most serious charge in this criminal case, when we're talking about a civil case, it's a different burden. The criminal case is beyond a reasonable doubt. When you're dealing with civil cases, it's by a preponderance of the evidence, 51% versus 49%. But then again, with a civil case, he's just at risk of losing his empire in terms of money, but his liberty is no longer at stake. So he can live to fight those cases outside of jail bars.
You bring up a good point, because if he would have been found guilty of racketeering, that could have forced him to forfeit all his businesses, right?
Absolutely. So if he would have been found guilty of racketeering conspiracy and of the sex trafficking, anything that was used in order to facilitate this crime. So, for example, his mansions in Florida and his mansion in Los Angeles would have been at risk that it would have been taken away from the government, since there was evidence that was put forth having to deal with that some of the sex trafficking took place inside of those homes. So he would have been at risk of losing that, and also a lot of his businesses and his money.
In his closing argument, one of Combs' defense attorneys asked jurors to summon the courage to acquit Combs, who conceded he could be violent, jealous, and a drug user, but whose lawyers argued the case is badly exaggerated to make Combs like something he is not. Do you think that's what happened, Brian Buckmeyer?
I don't know. This one I'm still trying to wrap my mind around, and I apologize. I'm trying to get information from different people as I go about this, trying to get information from people inside the court. I think, let me try to put it into words. I think when it comes to this case, this might have been more about how the case was handled than the actual people who testified. I could see how this might be an indictment on the women who testified, and I would say, as someone who watched them, I don't think it should be. I think, if anything, this is about how the case was handled by the government in terms of how they argued it, how they presented it, and the people that were selected. People even selected being the jurors, not the team themselves. And so I think as we move forward with this case and we see what's going to happen, because there is a possibility, although small, that Sean Combs walks out today, I think we just take stock of what we heard, what was argued, and what the result was, and not lay this at the feet of anyone who testified.
And now I understand, Aaron, a statement has been given on behalf of Cassie Ventura, star witness in this case. What are you learning?
Her attorney, Doug Wigdor, just sent us the following statement. This entire criminal process started when our client, Cassie Ventura, had the courage to file her civil complaint in November 2023. And Kira, we should say that's true. The criminal investigation is largely based on the statements in Cassie Ventura's lawsuit, and intensified, of course, once video from the 2016 hotel security camera became public. The statement from Doug Wigdor, her attorney, goes on to say, although the jury did not find Combs guilty of sex trafficking Cassie beyond a reasonable doubt, she paved the way for a jury to find him guilty of transportation to engage in prostitution. By coming forward with her experience, Cassie's attorney, Doug Wigdor, goes on to say, Cassie has left an indelible mark on both the entertainment industry and the fight for justice. We must repeat with no reservation that we believe and support our client, who showed exemplary courage throughout this trial. She testified for 4 days, often quite emotionally so, giving graphic, explicit detail of what she said she was made to do. And Sean Combs did not deny the facts of the freak-offs. Everything that happened in those hotel rooms did not get challenged by the defense. The defense simply saw it differently, as something that went on in a personal, consensual relationship, not sex trafficking. And that's how the outcome is reflected now, Kira.
Bernardo, I want to go on to read another part of that statement on behalf of Cassie Ventura's attorney, saying she displayed unquestionable strength and brought attention to the realities of powerful men in our orbit and the misconduct that has persisted for decades without repercussion. This case proved that change is long overdue, and we will continue to fight on behalf of survivors. Two things that stood out to me: powerful men in our orbit and the misconduct that persists, and change that is long overdue. Your thoughts?
Power and money. You can buy yourself out of a conviction. Let's be honest that if Sean Combs wasn't able to get the team that he got and pay for that defense team and experts and investigators to help defend himself, that we would have had a different outcome today. But money and power, that you can still get away with crimes if you have money and power. But I have to say, I was in the courtroom for Cassie's testimony, and she was a strong, strong witness. You can tell that the courage that she had, the strength that she exhibited. I mean, when she spoke and when she would cry from time to time, when she revisited those freak-offs and when she revisited those times when Sean Combs brutally beat her, and to see her in court sitting down, showing the strength and courage that she was able to overcome this. I think one of the most strongest moments that brought people to tears is when she said at some point that she went home and she told her husband, "You can do this without me," and that she wanted to cross the street and commit suicide because of what she had been through. But I'm glad that Cassie has been able to pick herself up and has been able to move on, taking it day by day, because it does show the strength that she got as a result of coming forward. That coming forward helped to bring closure to her.
Bernardo, thank you. Aaron, getting more insight from Sean Combs inside that courtroom, saying this coming from journalists in the press room. He was overcome with emotion as the verdict was read. His feet were visibly shaking throughout the reading of the verdict.
He has been an emotional defendant throughout the entire case. In fact, at one point, the judge had to admonish his attorney that Combs was gesturing and trying to make eyes with jurors as if to attempt to influence them when they were hearing certain testimony. And the judge made him sit straight and silent throughout much of the testimony. But as the verdict was being read, He started gesturing. He got down on the floor after it was over to kneel in prayer. Applause broke out into the courtroom. And I'm struck, Kira, the crowd has gathered here outside, and in the windows of the upper floors, courthouse employees are peering down to look at the streetscape below as more people rush toward these doors in anticipation of a possible release on bail sometime later on today, Kira.
And as we wait to hear what the outcome of that is, of course, if indeed the judge decides he could be released today, Brian Buckmeyer, let's talk about the jury makeup here and how it influenced this case, you think. We talked about the fact that it was 8 men, 4 women. Your thoughts on the number of men in this case versus women, and how you see that influencing what happened here?
Yes, I know oftentimes when we look at jurors, we look at race or gender. And yes, there's a possibility that the number of men in this case could have been beneficial to Sean Combs in terms of trying to decide what this relationship was like. But I think probably more importantly than race or gender would be age. And the reason why I say that is because when it comes to the conversation as to whether or not these were consensual relationships, which appears to be at the heart of the jury's verdict in terms of saying, yes, we saw that you brought these people across state lines for prostitution, but we don't believe there was force, fraud, or coercion for trafficking, and we don't believe that there was a criminal enterprise or that there was not 2 predicate acts, right? I think a large part of the not believing comes down to consent. And what I find, at least when I talk to a jury or just talk to people in general, is there's a big divide in terms of what is consent when you talk to someone who is over the age of 40 or 45 and under the age of 40 or 45. And when you have a jury where more than half of them are 51 years to 74 years old, and even if you go even below that, there's a number of people who are in their 40s, I think the conversation and the argument that Mark Agnifilo and his team were having about what it means to consent works for people in that age demographic. I think if we had a jury that was predominantly in their 20s or early 30s, this argument of consent would be very different. So while I do see that there is value in looking at the gender or the sex of the jurors, I think the age told us a lot more based on the arguments we saw.
Bernarda, you think it was smart that Sean Combs did not take the stand?
Absolutely. Absolutely. If Sean Combs would have taken the stand, this case would have become a deliberation of whether this jury believed what Sean Combs had to say, whether his demeanor came off as one as credible. Also, you have to think where if Sean Combs were to testify, there was a lot of evidence that the prosecution was not able to get in their case in chief because they were missing a link. And that link would have been Sean Combs. So they would have been able to get that evidence in had Sean Combs testified. So it would have changed the deliberation process, and we would have probably been looking at a completely different verdict. Also got to think, how would he be able to explain in terms of the brutal beating of Cassie and of Jane on that particular occasion?
Aaron, do you think we'll hear from the family? Sean Combs' mother, Janice, was in the courtroom along with his sons, his daughters. Are they expected to speak? Do you think they will speak?
I'm not sure. They haven't yet during the course of this trial, but the cars that they've been using to transport themselves to and from the courthouse are now pulling up to the front here, and they should be walking out those golden doors any moment. They may opt to wait until they know whether Combs is going to get released on bail, as his defense attorney argued he should be. And Combs almost seemed confident that the judge would grant it. He mouthed and said aloud to members of his family in the gallery, "I'm coming home, baby," after the split verdict here, acquitting him of the most serious charges, but finding him guilty of transportation for the purposes of prostitution. And because that is not a violent crime, the defense said that he has earned the right to get released on $1 million bail, as Combs offered to put up.
Aaron, we talk about the support outside of the courthouse there, the cheers that were heard from inside the courtroom. We should point out it's because he had his mom and his kids inside that courtroom. But if you want to talk about people showing up to support Sean Combs throughout all of this, the only celebrity that we witnessed, and correct me if I'm wrong, that came to show support was Kanye West.
That's right, and what a moment that was. The family now is coming out. You can see the mother of Sean Combs waving and giving a thumbs up. His sons walking out as well. Twin daughters. You can hear perhaps the cheers from some of the supporters, if you can hear them over the hum of the traffic. There were supporters in the courtroom throughout, a few outside, but only Kanye West showed up to court. And when he walked in his all-white suit, he said he was here to support Sean Combs, but he never saw him. He was not allowed inside the courtroom itself. He watched about 10 minutes of the proceedings inside an overflow room and was in and out of the courthouse in about 20 minutes, and we're not sure whether he was invited or not or showed up of his own volition. There really haven't been that many supporters apart from his family that just left court, as you can see, waving and giving a thumbs up moments ago. Sean Combs has been largely left alone with members of his family, including the mother of at least one of his children. His twin daughters were here at the beginning. They came at the end. His sons were here throughout the case, as was his mother. And when the jury came back stuck yesterday, Combs turned to his mother and said, "It's going to be okay." And today, after the outcome, he turned to his family and said, "I'm coming home, baby."
Bernardo, let me pull something out of what Aaron just said. Sean Combs was largely left alone through all of this. We're talking about somebody that was a huge businessman, a music mogul, a producer, a huge part of making hip-hop mainstream. He threw these lavish parties. He was always pointed to at big events and galas. The fact that Aaron said he was largely left alone, what does that tell you?
And he was. I was in a courtroom for the entire trial with the exception of one day. And literally the only person who showed up was Kanye. And the jury didn't get to see Kanye because he was in an overflow room. But in terms of being left alone, Kira, are you surprised? When you look at that video, the Intercontinental video, there's no running from it. And artists and celebrities, they wanted to run away from that because they didn't want to be associated with that type of violence. So it came down to money.
Bernardo, thank you. Aaron, want to take it to you as we reach the top of the hour here. We now wait to see if indeed the judge makes a decision. He says he will make it today, if he will allow Sean Combs to be released and walk out those doors behind you.
The judge gave them several hours to make written arguments before he issues a decision on release on bail. But Sean Combs is already celebrating after he was acquitted of the most serious charges that he faced that could have sent him to prison for life. He was convicted of transporting people for the purposes of prostitution, but taking that as a win, even though in theory he still faces up to 20 years in prison, Kira.
And acquitted of the most serious charges. Bernardo, Brian, Aaron, thank you. We're going to return you now to your regular programming. For some of you, that is Good Morning America. But I do want to tell you about an ABC News special, Verdict, the Diddy trial, that will air tonight, 10 Eastern. Our coverage continues on ABC News Live and abcnews.com. The entire team will be here for World News Tonight with David Muir. I'm Kira Phillips. Thanks for staying with us.
Hi, I'm Diane Macedo, and we are following that breaking news. Sean Diddy Combs has been found not guilty of racketeering, conspiracy, or sex trafficking. He was found guilty of transportation for the purposes of prostitution. Court has now been adjourned as the judge decides whether he will release Combs today. I want to bring in ABC's Rena Roy outside court and ABC News entertainment contributor Kelly Carter for more. Rena, talk to me about the reaction here in the courtroom, really, when this verdict came down.
Diane, this was an incredibly emotional moment. Sean Combs was visibly overcome with emotion. His feet were shaking under the table as the verdict was being read, and he then got down on the ground, kneeling in prayer when he found out that he had been acquitted on the most serious charges, racketeering, conspiracy, and sex trafficking. He turned to his family and he said, "I'm coming home, baby." And there were loud cheers and applauses in the courtroom. We know that his family has been here to support him almost every single day of this trial. They actually just walked out of the golden doors of this federal courthouse here in Lower Manhattan just a couple of minutes ago. And there are a lot, you can't see now because there's a bus here, but there are a lot of supporters here out here for him. Of course, people who also weren't so happy about this verdict. There's a lot of bloggers that have been covering this trial since day one, as well as all the media. We have been out here for almost 2 months at this point. Court is now adjourned for the day, but things are not over because the judge still has to weigh whether or not Combs will be released as early as today. That's what his defense attorneys are asking for, but prosecutors are arguing against that. So they both have several hours. The judge wants letters back from them making their cases at around 1 o'clock, and then we will potentially hear later today whether or not he will be released, Diane.
And I want to bring in our legal contributor, Bernardo Villalona, as well here on set with me. Bernardo, acquitted of the most serious charges, still found guilty of transportation to engage in prostitution. Each of those carries a maximum. Each of the 2 counts he was found guilty of there carries a max of 10 years. So what does the judge have to consider now, not only in terms of sentencing, but in terms of whether or not Sean Combs should be released today?
Sean Combs should be released today. He was acquitted of the most serious charges, and those also having to deal with violence. I was at his bail applications for the 3 times that he made a bail application. And the huge sticking point by the prosecution, by the government, is the violence itself, and that he was intimidating witnesses and still in contact and breaking the rules while he was in custody. Now, at this moment, those were allegations. Now a jury of his peers has spoken and has found him not guilty. So those are no longer allegations. So he should be freed. In terms of what the judge is going to consider is 1, that he was acquitted. 2, that the sentence that he is facing, there is not a mandatory minimum. So technically the judge can even sentence him to probation or to time served. 3, whether there's a risk of flight of him not returning to face sentencing date. That is highly unlikely, especially since Sean Combs knows what the exposure is, and also that for him to flee, it would give him a bigger exposure and almost guaranteed a jail sentence if he weren't to come back. So the judge should release him today. In terms of sentencing, now that's a long process there. The first thing that's going to take place is that the judge is going to order the Department of Probation to do a probation report and a probation interview of Sean Combs and do a deep dive into his background and ultimately make a recommendation as to what the sentence is going to be. Best believe that that intercontinental video is going to come back into light when it comes to sentencing, because the judge can take into account criminal acts that he wasn't convicted of when determining a sentence, a just sentence for Sean Combs. But given that he has a lack of criminal record in terms of something serious, it's highly likely that the judge will give him something in relation as to time served, or maybe just a few more months in terms of being incarcerated, since he was found guilty of 2 counts that technically can run consecutive.
Now, the prosecution has already said they're going to be seeking a severe sentence here, or a significant sentence. What do you think that means in terms of what they're going to at least try for?
Oh, I wouldn't be surprised if the prosecution doesn't ask for the max and asks for the sentences to be consecutive.
Just 20 years?
Yes, for 20 years, the max, because it's 10 years max as to each of these counts, and they can actually run consecutive. The prosecution is going to name out that, look, when it came to transportation to engage in prostitution, we're not talking about just 1 instance or 2 instances. During their closing arguments, they put up a photograph of 27 men that were actually trafficked as a result of doing these freak-offs and these hotel nights. So the prosecution is going to try to seek the maximum amount of sentence and also include those acts that he was found not guilty of in terms of that intercontinental video, and get statements from Jane and Cassie in order to try to move this judge to try to get the maximum sentence, which again is highly unlikely.
Bernardo, the defense argued throughout that all of the sexual encounters in this case were consensual. Does the fact that the jury found him not guilty of sex trafficking mean they agreed with that?
I wouldn't say that. I would say that the prosecution has to prove this case beyond a reasonable doubt. So just because a person is found not guilty doesn't mean that they necessarily said that they found that they weren't any freak-offs or that it wasn't consensual, but that there was some seed of doubt that prevented them from saying that he is guilty. When they say not guilty, it's not saying that they're proclaiming that Sean Combs is innocent. What it is that that person, Sean Combs, is being acquitted. That verdict says that the prosecution did not prove this count beyond a reasonable doubt, but not necessarily that they believe in their heart that Sean Combs didn't commit these acts and that it wasn't consensual.
And I want to bring in our chief investigative correspondent, Aaron Katersky, who's been at the court throughout this whole trial. Aaron, what sticks out to you about the way this verdict came down and the discussions that these attorneys are now having as they write letters to the judge about whether or not Combs should be released?
They have several hours now, Diane, to make the case whether Sean Combs should be released on bail. Combs himself offered $1 million bail, and the judge indicated to him that he did not want to go back to MDC, the federal lockup in Brooklyn where he's been held. And that's when he clasped his hands together as if to say, that's exactly right, Judge. And so the judge said he would decide today whether to release him on bail. Prosecutors asked for a few hours to put their letter in opposing it. He does still, as prosecutors point out, face the possibility of 20 years in prison on the conviction of transportation for the purposes of prostitution. And the way prosecutors see it, he's a flight risk and a potential danger. Even though they did not prove the sex trafficking or the racketeering conspiracy, prosecutors still told the judge he has a predilection to committing crimes, including violent crimes, and represents a potential danger, particularly to women. He also, we should say, Diane, faces at least 6 civil lawsuits that accuse him of acts of violence. We'll see where those shake out in the coming weeks and months, but Combs would no doubt like to try and fend those off as quickly as possible. Outside here, Diane, there is a crowd of supporters that looks like they're going to hang out to see whether he walks through those golden doors sometime this afternoon.
And I want to drill down on those civil suits with our legal contributor, Brian Buckmeyer, also here with me on set. Brian, I think it's in the realm of 60 civil lawsuits against Sean Combs right now. How does this verdict impact those cases?
Yeah, so about 60 or 59 civil lawsuits. I believe 14 of them involve a minor. And so the impact for those cases on this is somewhat positive in some lights, actually, ironically enough, and somewhat negative. The negative, obviously, in that he was found not guilty of the RICO conspiracy and the sex trafficking. So if there's any allegations that mirror that in these civil complaints, Sean Combs is going to feel very confident that he might be able to win those. But different allegations, different alleged victims. And I think, as Bernardo pointed out as well, there's a different standard there. And it comes to a criminal case, it's beyond a reasonable doubt, a much higher standard than the civil standard of preponderance of evidence, more likely than not, or 51%. But the reason why I say it could be potentially positive for those filing civil lawsuits is if Sean Combs was found guilty of that racketeering conspiracy, there would be a forfeiture application in terms of trying to dismantle that racketeering conspiracy, that criminal enterprise, where the federal government would have had their opportunity to take money out of Sean Combs before the civil lawsuits would have had their opportunity. So in a way, Sean Combs may still have enough money in his pocket that those filing civil lawsuits might be able to find a victory through that process. I compare and contrast to, for example, the R. Kelly trial, where he was found guilty of racketeering conspiracy, and there was a forfeiture there, and many of the people filing civil lawsuits against R. Kelly found it difficult to win in those cases.
And I want to bring in Kelly Carter to talk about the cultural impact here, because